evening, everyone. Welcome to the San Mateo County Dental Society meeting. It looks like we have a good audience right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and present our speaker. I'll introduce myself. My name is Wan Lee, and I'm the 2024 San Mateo County Dental Society president. Before we get started, I want to review how we will be running this meeting. All participants will be placed on mute. Our presenter will provide information about how to use remote dental professionals. During the presentation, you may post a question into the Q&A box or the chat box. For those participants on your desktop, the chat box is located on the bottom of your screen. For those on iPad or iPhone, the chat box should be on the upper right. Please feel free to post your questions, and if time permits, we will go over them at the end. So now let's get started. Tonight, the presenter is Christine Sison. Christine is the CEO of the Swiss Monkey, a staffing and virtual front office services company. She has built and managed a dental practice for over 10 years. Christine earned her bachelor in neurobio from UC Berkeley, and master in public health policy and management from the Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to her work in dentistry, Christine conducted brain tumor research at UCSF, assisted in the integration of IT into clinics and hospitals, and later led the development of community-wide healthcare system, including telemedicine efforts. Please welcome Christine Sison.
Hi everyone, thank you, Juan, and I think you added a little bit of the French twist there we were talking. I like it. So, hi everyone, I'm so excited to be able to speak with you today. And so we have about an hour here, and the goal here is to give you a blueprint for how practices that we've been working with have really used remote dental professionals in a way to help provide their offices with a competitive advantage. So this is really meant to be an interactive session. So please, if you have questions, I think I saw somebody driving, obviously being safe, please chime in. I can stay after the hour, but I think this will be a good discussion. And my goal here is to be able to impart as much as I can about how our practices have been able to integrate this kind of really interesting model. It's not new. I've been doing kind of outsourcing for a while, but I think we've been really learning how to really integrate it in a more useful way for our private practices. So again, just what Swiss Monkey is, obviously I have that angle with us. As Juan said, what we do is we really run, we have a network of about 3,000 dental professionals all across the country. And what we do is we provide those professionals to our practices, and we provide all the technology and infrastructure to make sure that all that information is secure and compliant. So the goal isn't necessarily to talk about us, but it is, obviously we're going to be sharing our my experiences there, and also the best way that we found in terms of integrating these remote professionals. So Juan, thank you for giving me a little background about myself. My prior history prior to dentistry was in medical. And for those of you who are wondering how I kind of made that leap, my husband is a dentist, which is how I kind of got sucked into the dental vortex. And so even that practice uses a lot of the outsourcing kind of model that we're talking about. So I do want to share, we do have one special guest here also with us, Minnie, who is our Chief Experience Officer. She's on the call, so I'll have her. She may jump in every now and then to be able to share some additional insight. So I'm happy to have her with me. So in terms of just objectives, I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about, outsourcing and remote work it's not necessarily new, but I want to talk about why, since COVID, it's really seen an uptick, especially among private practices. We've seen a lot of our DSOs, larger practices already kind of embrace this model, but I think it's important to kind of look at why now, why is this happening, and how is it starting to really gain traction? And then I really want to dig into kind of the blueprints, the how-tos, and be able to answer all of your questions that you might have, any concerns. I know I spoke to a couple of doctors and they had questions around security. How much do you pay? How do what does the transparency structure look like? So I'll do the best that I can to answer as many of those questions During the presentation, I do talk fast, so please let me know if I need to slow down or you want to come back and revisit. But we have a lot of content to go through, but that's kind of the framework for today's meeting. So where did all the workers go? So I think we're still seeing this all across the country in terms of just kind of this interesting distribution of where everyone is living. Obviously, since COVID, we've seen people not only leave the industry, but maybe move positions, change housing locations, et cetera. And even now, when we look at the stats, we still see that there are almost twice as many job openings as there are workers in the US available. So we're seeing for every one person, there are 2 jobs. So just in general, there are not even enough workers in the US to fill the positions that are here. And we're still working in this kind of, I call it a constrained labor market, where even after so many years, we do have a little bit of a, we help obviously with job placement. We're seeing people that are available to go to work. We're seeing that like, hey, I want to come back to work, but I don't want to come back full time, or I want to have multiple positions. So it's kind of still looking at this, like we call it a constrained labor market, where you have a segment of the population that is able to come to work, but they're not coming back as full as they were prior to COVID. So I think that's one interesting stat. We're also seeing in the staffing market kind of this rise of gig and contingent workers. And that's a terminology that some of you may know. It's really prevalent in the tech world, where you have a lot of these individuals that are looking to work as 1099s. Obviously, we can't do that on the clinical side, but we're seeing a lot more people saying, hey, you know what? I want to work as a 1099. I want to have more control over my schedule. I want to have more control over where I work. And I want to have control over how much I make and the pace I make it at. And that's been really different than I think prior, where you had technology kind of like limiting the growth of the ability for people to work remotely. And even 20 years ago, it was like 2% of the working population. And now they say almost like 43% of the population that can work remotely have some kind of hybrid remote work schedule in place. So we're really starting to see this kind of interesting segment of the talent population that's saying, hey, I want more flexibility. I want more time to be able to work where I want to work. And I think this is all fine and good, but when you have a dental practice and we're used to, having people there that are able to provide that, face-to-face patient experience, the question is, can the healthcare market, can dental practices, can they adjust how they staff a practice in a way where we can tap into the market? And the answer is yes. And we're going to talk through how to really do that. But I think that's going to be really important. So you see a lot of my larger organizations, you're seeing DSOs, they're already building kind of these outsourced talent pools and centers, because they want to tap and be able to take advantage of these individuals, because it is a larger segment of the population. For my private practices, we're just not used to it. We're not sure how to do that. But today we'll talk about what does that really look like if you're interested in doing that. Another stat that was interesting to me is by 2030, which is not just kind of a blink away, there is an estimated 40% of the US workforce that will not be available for full-time work. Now, there's a lot of questions around, but the idea here is that you have this, this Gen Z, millennial generation that's saying, hey, I don't necessarily just want one job. I might want to curate a more diverse working portfolio where I have 2 to 3 positions. We see this a lot for hygienists that might work in 2 to 3 different practices. But in general, I think we're seeing like a larger population saying, hey, I might want something that's more curated and something that has a little bit more diversity in terms of my work portfolio. And again, all this is really interesting, but the real question for a dental provider, for a CEO and dental dentist like yourself is like, what do you do with that kind of information, especially when you're trying to run a dental practice? So a couple more things around the labor market is this new workforce generation, that baby boomer generation, that's definitely transitioning out. And we're seeing this millennial and Gen Z population. They are now the largest workforce working labor market in the US. So that's 1981 and younger. So if you're born after that, that's this new generation. And I think there are some certain characteristics. Obviously, they're kind of like, these are generalizations, but there are certain themes here I think that are important, that are changing the way that employers are approaching staffing and approaching how they build their teams. And I want to go through, I think, some pretty interesting kind of trends around this generation. I think most of you might resonate with you in that sense that like this generation, they tend to want to get paid more and promoted faster. So, I think the days where I used to work at the post office and wait 10 years for your promotion, you kind of wait for the standard base increase every single year, you wait for your annual review. I think those days are I wouldn't say gone, but I think they're limited. And I think if you have conversations with a younger generation, I've had people where they come back to me 6 months after we place them, where they're already having conversations saying, hey, how do I approach a promotion with my doctor? Like if you've been running a dental practice for 20 years, like that seems unheard of. I mean, it's like, wow, you've only been here for 6 months. How do I even know what you're doing? How are you having enough guts to even ask me, can I have a raise? But you're going to see that with this next generation, that really is something that's a little bit more standard. They're not afraid to ask for those things. And what we see is that they vote with their feet, especially with this market where there's just so many job opportunities available, that if they don't like the answer, they're definitely more willing to like say, okay, well, that's fine. I'm going to look for something else. So I think that is one aspect to, I think, staffing that makes it more challenging to run a practice these days. And they're digitally native, meaning this is a population here that grew up with their cell phones, with social media. And the way that impacts the dental practice is that these are individuals that can enter and exit out of conversation with a tap of a button, right? Like they don't like the conversation on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, whatever it is, they can just press no. They're used to usually having really short conversations. And again, that's not bad or good. It's just that, if you have this generation that hasn't really been trained in terms of like presenting really great treatment plans, having social empathy, all of those pieces, the question is who ends up training these individuals, right? Is it schools? Is it the offices? So I think that's interesting when we do staffing, in the sense of like these doctors, like, hey, she has all of the great technical skills, but she doesn't have the communication skills. She just doesn't have the empathy to be able to show, hey, how to connect with a patient that has high anxiety, to be able to sell a high-end treatment plan. And part of that has to do with the fact that like really the social media impact has made those conversations, I think, more curt. And so the question is like, for my doctors, is if you're finding that the communication skills are not on par with what you're used to, I tell my doctors, either one, you should provide the training. And if you yourself within your office can't do that, lots of options, whether it's coaching or sending them to CEs, to look into that, because we are seeing a little of that's starting to fall behind in terms of like, hey, do they really have the skill set to do what they need to do, especially in the front? And then we're seeing, there is a great resignation. I think the number is changing there, where it's like, it used to be like half of the people are actively looking for a new job. I think the other stat here that I thought was interesting is that a third of people are willing to leave a job without another one in place. This, I think, might have changed a little bit, but the concept here is that, again, it's kind of this job hopping, where some of you might or have an open position. You're like, man, if I don't say yes, like most of them are willing to leave right away. And that's really interesting because people didn't used to do that. People would only leave jobs when they would have another job that was secure, they knew it was happening. Now you're seeing 1 in 3 people willing to leave a job without even having another one in place. Again, I think just talking to the fluidity of what the job market is looking like now. And then, when the ADA just took this, I don't think this is any surprise that, yes, staffing is a huge, it's 1 in 3 practices are having some kind of front desk staffing issues, probably 1.5 having some kind of dental or clinical staffing issue. This is absolutely affecting, for those of you not looking at me, for those of you, this is absolutely affecting the business of the practice, saying, hey, if you're not staffed, you're not answering your phones, you're not able to follow up with unscheduled treatment, you're not able to market all of the services you're doing, all of that ends up having an impact to your bottom line. And I think it was like something like 11% of reduction in practice capacity by not being fully staffed. And for $1 million practice, it's about $100,000 loss. So kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of the talk today is like, all right, well, what do we do, right? If we don't have enough people on site, maybe we don't have the right people in the right places. I always tell my doctors, like, you want to do active reallocation of your team members, in the sense that like, hey, if you have a strategy, you constantly want to be looking at, do I have the right people in the right places to where I want to go? And if you don't, and they're not within the 4 walls of your office, would you be open to looking at, tapping into this hybrid workforce model? And really the idea here is, the thesis is pretty simple, in the sense that like the traditional dental model is like everything happens on site, check in, check out, the scheduling, obviously all the clinical aspects, the billing, reservation reminders, etc. So most of the stuff happens on site. Most of you are probably doing some micro experiment of the offsite. Your accountant, your coach, your marketing team, those are all part of your team, but they're done offsite. And so the thesis around a hybrid model is like saying, hey, can you take some of those non-patient facing things And can you pull it out so that your on-site team can focus on just the things that have to be or should be done on site? And if you're thinking about, gosh, I only have 2 people on site, I'm growing my practice, I need another 3, but it's really hard for me to find someone at a rate that is going to be economical for my office. You're almost like thinking about, if I can tap into someone, we're all in California, if you can tap into someone in another state and paying 30% less with no payroll costs, would that make sense for you? And if you were to do it, what kind of tasks would that look like? And we'll go into some of the pieces here. So anything not patient facing can technically be done offsite. Now, it doesn't mean that you should, but it means that you can. And we've had to do that a few times with offices where either they're really small. We've had one office where all 5 people in the front desk resigned on one day with no notice. And in that case, you might have to go very, very aggressive and say, okay, since we have no front desk, or maybe we're really small where we have to do this, yes, you can pull everything offsite. This is not what I recommend. We don't want to, we obviously want to create the special patient experience. But in worst case scenarios where sometimes you're taken hostage, your whole front desk leaves, or maybe you're like, hey, it's not feasible. Your front desk is asking for too much money. And you're like, okay, I can't really do this, or they're toxic. In certain cases, yes, we can absolutely say, hey, if you call me and say, hey, Christine, I have no front desk, what we will do then is we're going to be really aggressive. We're going to triage calls. We're going to remote into your software. We're going to give you people that can do a lot of the things that typically are done on site, off site, until you can find somebody. And what happens then is we start to move things back on site. But you can see here that it's really a fluid model in terms of like what can be done on site and off site. Typically, when you call us and you're just exploring this model, we'll decide, hey, what works best for you. And there's a lot of different factors. But again, the thesis here is that, you can be very aggressive and go all the way and basically say, hey, we're going to have basically a virtual front desk all the way around. This can work if you're a small office, maybe you're a startup, you're in a really rural area, or you're kind of your back's against the wall and you have no other choice. Typically, my offices fall somewhere around here where it's like they kind of use a remote team to do their rev cycle, which is like billing, posting, insurance, and patient follow-up. Or maybe they have someone that is just answering their phones part-time during the lunch hour, or maybe on Fridays when they're off early, or maybe on Saturdays or after hours. So, in this case, in the offsite model, what's really nice is you can actually play Tetris a little bit and say, hey, what do I want as a full complete team? Who do I have on site? What kind of talent do I have? And then we can basically tap into the talent all across the country. You have no geographic barriers, right? So that's really, really cool. And you can basically piece your team together, right? And it's a very fluid model. And you can say, hey, I only want this for 2 months, 3 months, etc. But that's what's really cool about the hybrid model, is that you're not stuck to one thing, right? And you can actually end up having a lot of resiliency if you're interested in using this kind of model. I want to talk a little bit of the value proposition here, because I have a lot of doctors saying, hey, is this going to cost me more money? And the idea here is, no, if you're going to take a one-to-one kind of experiment here, typically what ends up happening is because through a remote service, whether it's through us or somebody else, it's typically a direct cost, meaning you're not hiring them as an employee. So you're not having to pay payroll taxes. You're not having to pay an insurance. You're not, especially in California, the 6-hour rule around like, hey, after 6 hours, you have to, provide the 20-minute break and the lunch hour. All of those things I think are benefits in the sense that like, hey, you don't have to worry about that as an employer, which can be, I know, kind of a big headache. But the idea here is that you're not just saving on that. Typically what should happen is that if the person who is like, let's just say, doing the billing and posting for you, typically what happens in the office, they're doing billing and posting for you, but at the same time, they're also answering the phones, they're doing insurance verification. So what should be, let's just say, 3 hours in the week might be a 6-hour task. So they're doubling the amount of work just because they're not doing one thing. But with a dedicated remote professional, the idea here is that they can actually be much more efficient. They can focus on that one thing and get it done. And so you should actually decrease the amount of time. And what should happen here is when you add another person to do that task, I tell my doctors, when you add another person, you're going to increase your cost, right? Because you're adding now an additional individual. You shouldn't just be adding a cost. Then the next piece is, okay, Jim, now that we have Minnie that's doing this, the goal here is that now I'm freeing up 4 hours more of your week. I want you to do, I want you to provide a better patient experience. I want you to schedule to go. I want you to sell more Invisalign, et cetera. So really you're increasing your top line. So I tell my doctors, if this is not either giving you more peace of mind and it's not creating more revenue and production for you, you probably shouldn't do it. Because the last thing you want is just to add another remote dental professional, and now you're just losing money because you're not actually increasing the top line. So the goal here is like, you want to be able to give your on-site team more time to do revenue generating activities. You don't want to be paying, I think, what used to happen in dental practices is you'd have your hygiene coordinator become your treatment coordinator, become your billing person. All of a sudden now they're in the back office, they're not talking to any patients, and they're just doing tasks that have nothing to do with patients. I think those days are gone. I think like the days that you're paying someone $35 an hour to just do like follow up with insurance, do insurance verification, send claims, post checks. A lot of people like it because it's very secure. It's I wouldn't say easier, but it's like it's a more simple task. Especially in California where labor is just much more expensive. If you're going to choose something, like look at pulling out the things that it's not important. It's very, very important to get those things right. The idea is if you don't have enough talent and you want to be able to maximize the talent you have on site, you want them to really be producing for you. You want them to be focused on revenue generating activities. And if they're doing things that are important, but they aren't patient facing and they're not increasing your production, those are when you're taking the inventory of things to pull out to remote dental professional, those are the things that I would consider pulling out first, right? I don't want you pulling out like, following up with unscheduled treatment. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless you have a team that doesn't know how to do that. Well, I'm going to leave a little bit more to talk about that, but that's really important. All right. Let me pause here. Jim, are there any questions or anything? I know I'm kind of going through a lot of different pieces. I get excited about this model, but any questions that people have so far?
No questions so far, but just a reminder to everyone, we will have time at the end to submit questions, and we can even unmute you if you'd like to ask them directly to Christine.
Okay, perfect. All right. So for those of you who are interested, let's say you get your remote team member, they're fantastic. It's not just finding the remote dental professional and then pressing go. There is some technology and infrastructure that needs to be put in place. Excuse me, especially after you all saw the change debacle here where you had the big cybersecurity breach. Now this is as important as ever. Is if you're going to have someone offsite working with your practice, this is whether the remote dental professional or maybe it's a team member that's like, hey, doctor, I love working here, but I want to work one day offsite. We want to make sure that they have the technology here to be able to do that, in a compliant manner. You don't want them using their cell phones. You don't want them using like non-compliant HIPAA platforms, etc. You want to make sure you have all that taken care of. Excuse me 1 second. It always happens right when I have it. I'm just going to take All right, so we'll talk about some technology that we have available, but that is really important. I see a lot of practices and people that are working remotely on Facebook and social media. They're like, oh, I want to do this. And what they're doing is they're using like their AOL email or their Gmail email. They're sending a bunch of stuff via their personal email. So you just want to stay away from that. Okay. So if you're interested in doing this, here's what I would recommend. Here's kind of the stepwise. We can walk through it with you, but if you're going to do it on your own, that's fine too. I would say before you get started, you really want to think about like, what is your vision? What do you need done? Because there are a lot of things in the front office that don't need a full-time team member or that are keeping your team from doing things like following up with really, high value appointments. So I would say meet with your team and saying, hey, I want to go from, $100,000 to $150,000. What is keeping us from doing that? And so typically when you have the feedback of your team, or you might already know what's keeping them, then you can start to really create a rule for your offsite team member. I do see doctors that drive this down like, hey, we're going to be doing this. Typically, if your team isn't on board with a remote model, it's not that it doesn't work. It's just that you don't see the full fruition of what it can do. So I really like to see really good alignment with the on-site team and the doctor in terms of like, hey, this is what we want to do. And there are really, I think, there are great ways of having this kind of conversation. One of the ways I have it is exactly what I mentioned. It's like I try to make it agnostic, saying, "Hey guys, let's go from." I typically make it a financial goal because it has nothing to do with any personalities. Like, hey, I want to go from here to here. How do we do it? And typically, people give us feedback and they say, "Hey, doctor, I'd love to do it, but you know what? I'm doing too much billing and posting, or I'm following up with insurance. I'm doing so much verification, or I can't do hygiene week care because of XYZ." And you basically take an inventory of that, and you say, okay, if we don't have the on-site team to do this, and it's really hard to hire, can we give them an assistant to be able to do those tasks? And typically, what most of my doctors do, I'd say 80% of my doctors, they use this model on a fractional basis, saying, hey, can you use someone 3 to 4 hours a day, 3 to 4 days a week to get this done to increase your production, right? So if you add an extra $1,000 of maybe overhead on the back end, can we increase your production to $10,000, $15,000 a month, whatever that might be? So before you get started, you want to have a really clear understanding of like, what do you need done? Because I really don't want any of my doctors adding expenses for no reason, right? So maybe just like, hey, my team is really burnt out, but you want to have this idea of like, what does success look like? And we want to take away, I want to move from like, hey, this is a role-based description. It's like, what are the specific tasks? And let's move that offsite. Once you do that, you're committed to that. There is obviously the technology infrastructure that we talked about. Again, you don't necessarily need to do that. It's not scary, but there is pieces here where you want to have like the ability to log in, some productivity software. Jim, I think I will do that after this slide. But the idea here is whenever you have a remote team member, for me, I find that my doctors and my team, what ends up happening is they hire a remote team member and there's no level of accountability. There's no transparency. And so at least with us, I make sure that at the end of each day, all of the remote team members that we work with, they always submit a productivity report. It is just part of what we do. Sometimes my doctors don't even look at it, but I'll tell you, it really does create a sense of security, not only for your offsite team to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so proud of the work that I did, and here's everything I accomplished, but it also gives the doctor a sense of like, oh, okay, I'm paying you $25 an hour for 4 hours a day. Like, what did I get from that? And having that infrastructure at the very beginning is really important. So if you can set that at the beginning, saying, hey, at the end of each shift, even if it's one of your team members that want to work from home, if you feel like one of the things that are impeding you from using this model is like you're just not sure if they're working, have them submit a productivity report. We have something that you can use for really inexpensive, or just have them send it to some other HIPAA compliant platform. But I think for us, the doctors love it. It's a way for you to understand whether or not the remote team member is working for you. One of the things that I love about the things that we're using is that sometimes the doctors think they need 8 hours of extra phone support. Then when we look at the log, we're like, man, we paid them for 8 hours, but most of the calls are coming between 9 to 1 o'clock. And there's maybe only one call in the evening, and it's not really worth it. So the idea around data, productivity management, and also having data available to you is that you have a really good sense of like, is the remote team actually effective? Is it adding revenue to your practice? And are there ways that you might need to titrate that schedule? So we'll go through some options of how we're using it, but the technology infrastructure is really important. Then you connect the talent. After you connect the talent, whether it's through us or somebody else, you want to treat them just like a regular team member. I don't care whether it's through us or somebody else. You want some management and training and quality assurance on there, because here's what ends up happening. I would say for a lot of doctors who've used this and they have kind of PTSD, what ended up happening before was that they would connect to a remote team member and they would just let them go. And what we found is that between the first, like really the 30 to 60 days is like when you're imprinting this offsite team member to your office, to the culture of how you answer the phones, how you schedule, how you do write-offs, how you handle patients with a balance. And I'll say every single office is different. And if you are not committed to making sure your remote team member is successful and really onboarding them properly, you're gonna I think you're gonna see a lot more risk for attrition. There's gonna be a lot more issues for errors, and you're just not regularly meeting with them. So for us, we actually have a quality assurance team that Minnie runs. We're rechecking with them 30 to 60 days out after they onboard, and we actually recommend that your remote team member huddle with your team just like your on-site team huddles should be huddling every day, at least for the first month. because the last thing you want is like, oh my gosh, that person didn't know. And I'll tell you, hiring your remote team or not giving them the security of connecting with the team, I think does provide a lot of risk for just mishaps and miscommunications. And I want to just let Minnie, is there anything else you want to add to that? Because I know you do a lot of the quality assurance that we want to share with our doctors that are doing this.
Christine, we can't hear her. I don't know if she's saying anything.
Oh, you can't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, guys. Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Okay, we'll have her.
We'll go back into it. Oh, okay. No, you can hear me. All right, guys. Sorry about that. I definitely went into detail there, but can you guys hear me now?
Yes, but we do not see the
perfect.
slides or the screen.
Oh, okay. I
Okay.
unmuted myself, so I think that's perfect.
That's okay.
All right. So yeah, pretty much what Christine mentioned, she covered all of the high level details there. But as we're doing a lot of the quality assurance, on our end is that the P3 platform and the productivity report that the virtual team member is able to provide to the practice on a daily basis, it really allows them to showcase the work that they're providing for the practice. And not only that, but it also allows the office to be able to see where are these areas that maybe their offices are having some struggles with, and areas where they can also offer some mentorship to their on-site team, because a lot of them are actually having the on-site team also do productivity reports for, just accountability for end of day. And so a lot of training opportunities, but more so almost like to just kind of piggyback back on Christine, if the virtual team member is working about 4 hours a day and they're working and their hourly is about $25 an hour, but that virtual team member was able to add to the reservation book, anything from 5,000 to 10,000 or more on just treatment, or, bringing in new patients and or collecting on treatment or future reservations. It's like, oh my goodness, like our return on our investment for the virtual team member is definitely profitable. And so it's just really amazing what we're seeing and how our doctors are really utilizing this data to help support the growth of their practice. So eventually what we see is our doctors will start off small with a few hours, and then as they see the progression and the numbers go up, they start adding and increasing those hours or the additional support.
Yeah, and that's and I will talk. I mean, even a good point. A lot of when if you are brand new to this, I recommend if possible, you start off small, especially because I know most people are really nervous about this, which you should be. Your team members are nervous about this. You're like, God, this is my patient. Obviously, your private practice, you are your community. You want to provide a really great, high-end service. And if you were like my practice that was started, we were just like, oh my gosh, like I don't know who this person is. They're going to be reaching out to my patients. Start off small. Start off with maybe non-patient things or something that are very simple tasks. You don't want to outsource the most difficult tasks. Like you want to increase your probabilities of success, and you don't want to be offloading your riskiest activity. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but while we're talking about productivity and transparency, this is an example of what all the team members use. Again, you don't need to use this. This is available to you if you'd like to use it. But at the end of the day, what we recommend all of our remote team members do is that they submit something called a productivity report. I just created one. And so whether or not, it's 2 hours or 8 hours that they're working, at the end of the day, they actually submit what did they do that day, how many calls they made, how many outreaches they did, how much hygiene they scheduled, treatments they scheduled, if they're doing claims, all of those pieces. And this is available to the doctor. And again, what's really nice is that for our doctors that have multiple people or maybe multiple team members, they could actually end up seeing, and this is sandbox data. So this is not, I don't want to show any patient information, but the doctors can actually see over time how that team member is doing. And you can actually say, hey, gosh, Minnie, you're doing fantastic, but compared to Jim, you're not doing it. It's great. So the dashboard that we're having allows doctors to do comparative analysis over time, over multiple team members, if you have multiple team members, and across sites. So just for some of you, if you have multiple locations, this is a great kind of comparative tool that allows you just data to be able to assess the productivity of the team member. It is also, I know some of my coaches, they also use this as part of their performance evaluation. And I know if you have those team members that are like, hey, Dr. Jim, I know you're working for you 6 months, but I would like to go from $25 to $30 an hour. Typically what will end up happening if they're using this platform is they say, hey, why don't we pull up your productivity log and let's see how you're doing, right? And then you can get a sense of like, hey, if that person has, if they happen to schedule you an extra $5,000 to $10,000 a month the last 3 months, maybe that extra $5 an hour is worth it. But it gives you the ability to engage in especially salary conversations in an agnostic manner without a lot of emotion. Because I know some of my doctors, when they get in these conversations, it's a team member that's been there for a long time. You kind of feel bad. Inflation's going. I mean, there's all these pieces, and we're not using data to be able to assess whether or not, one, can we afford it, but two, do they, are they adding enough value to the practice to really justify that? And when you have data like this, it allows you to be able to assess of like, hey, you know what? I'd love to give it to you. It looks like we can do better here in terms of the treatment production. If I can see this increase by another 20% over the next 6 months, let's come back to this conversation. Those are the goals for you. Track how you're doing, and then let's come back to the conversation. So lots of interesting ways that you can use data if people are actually reporting their productivity. It just tends to be for us a really prominent tool, especially for our offsite team members, just because you're not seeing what they're doing. So for us, this makes a lot of sense. But again, the concept here is you can even do it for your on-site team. So I'll stop here and then we go back to the presentation here. I think I saw a couple of questions, Jim. There, do we want to answer those or do we want to wait till the end?
We'll hold them to the end. Questions.
Okay, perfect. So we talked, I started to touch a little bit on like, okay, hey, we're going to be starting off, like, how do I think about, where do I start? And again, every office is a little bit different, but all things being equal, if you're really nervous, you don't know where to start off with things that either, that again, have low risk for error, right? So you might say, hey, let's have them just fill out a form, fill out this insurance verification piece, something that's not patient facing, or insurance aging, where it's like, hey, they're following up with why something was not paid. Because worst case scenario, let's just say they're talking to an insurance rep, they have no impact on your brand, right, or patient experience. Now, if they're going to do phones or high TV care, I'm not necessarily opposed to this. I would say, like, if they're going to answer your phones, there are certain things that should be happening, especially if you're going to have them scheduled. If they're only going to take messages, not really a big deal. We have a standard set of like, hey, here's how you take a message. Here's the information that we need. Most of my offices, they want their offsite team member professional to schedule. Here's the thing. If you're going to have them touch your schedule, one of the things that's really interesting about the remote model is that it is going to highlight where you have gaps in your systems. And what I find is that my doctors are like, yes, just have mini schedule. Like, wherever there's a gap, just put it in there. And then all of a sudden, 3 days later, we're like, why did you schedule that person there? We didn't have an assistant that day. Or like, actually the doctor only wants 3 new patients a day, not 4, or whatever it is. So if you are going to have your team member schedule, I highly recommend that you have blocks in your schedule, at least initially, until that person understands how you like to schedule. They'll tell you every office does schedule differently, but it's a really great exercise for your systems within the office to get much tighter. So it kind of forces the hand. If you don't have good systems, you don't have good protocols, now that you have multiple people that are not necessarily in the same space, touching your schedule, touching an account, now what ends up happening is everyone needs to document in the patient account what happened, what conversations they need to have, and also how to, like, what kind of scheduling kind of approach we're having. Now, from my perspective as an employer, I actually love that, because if there's anyone on this call that only has one person in the front, I'll tell you what ends up happening, and it's not anyone's fault, is that the person in the front ends up they're internalizing all that information. Everything they're having with the conversation with the patients tend to be in that person's head. Now, that's fine if that person never leaves you. But should that person get sick, they end up leaving or whatever it is, now they take all that intellectual property with them. And guess what? We're holding the bag, and we have no idea where anything is. So for me personally, I like the idea of immortalizing all the information inside what we have a practice vault, but also inside of the practice management software, so that as a business, we're not relying on one person. And I think for most small practices, one or two people, we're highly, highly dependent on making sure that those people always show up and all the conversations are there. So when you do have a remote team where, yes, it forces a hand here in terms of having really strong systems, but also documentation and systems and system design becomes really, really important. Auditing the schedule. Now, when I say auditing a schedule, for those who are not familiar with that term, essentially for my GP offices, I like an office. If I were to go into your office tomorrow, I would love your office should have like an audited schedule, meaning there are at least the 4 things on every single reservation and should be on your schedule. Like if I go in there, I should know, like, oh, Minnie's coming in, and here are the 4 things I like. Is a treatment plan signed? What is the patient portion? What the next visit is? Is it, a crown for 1.5 hours on this tooth? And there's a hygiene reservation, appointed or not appointed. At the minimum, those are the 4 things that should be in every single reservation. I don't see some of my practices don't do it, but usually if you're on point, you should have that for every single appointment. That way, if someone's out sick, your dental assistant can be like, oh, okay, you owe $25 today, let's get paid, and here's your treatment plan. Some of my offices have, maybe someone who's not skilled at doing that. In those scenarios, you can pull that off, right? Like, just say, we have practices in Hawaii where there isn't a huge talent pool in certain areas of the island. And so what they end up doing is, in those cases, you might need to tap into someone in another part of the country who actually has the skill set to do that. Typically, I like that to be done on site because that is a more complex process. But in the case, again, what's really cool with this kind of remote model is that it's highly dependent on the kind of talent you have on site. So if you have a really strong talent pool, you might only need to stick to maybe like some calls and maybe some help with insurance verification. But in some cases, or maybe the person that you've had for 20, 30 years, they're deciding to retire, they're reducing their hours, and now you have someone with no dental experience or limited dental experience, but has like maybe a great persona and personality. You might need to pair them up with someone off-site that has a lot more experience. And so in this case, you can use the model to actually, tap into a more skilled individual to come into the office. So the adoption process, all things being equal, I like to start off with non-patient facing things that are and in small increments, a few hours a day, just to start off, because this model isn't like exchanging glove brand A for glove brand B. It's not that kind of innovation. We're breaking processes, we're breaking workflows, and we're changing behavior. That takes a little time. So sometimes my doctor's like, oh my gosh, I'm sure no one here, I don't trust my team. Let's just go move everything offsite. I mean, it's really, really tough to do that because people are already really anxious about the model. And it takes time to adopt it. So I would say start off small, and then you can titrate up as you need to. Some of my offices, they only use it like 5 days a month, and it's just enough for their team to feel like a little bit of relief. So what's really cool about this is you can, it's fluid. We know that dental practices change, especially as you evolve, as you grow. Maybe as you're starting to, add more team members, you might not need an extra one. You might just need a fractional team member. You can really use this model to be able to adjust to the staffing that you need at the time of your practice. I want to go through, I think I talked about all the important considerations. I want to talk a little bit mindset and readiness. This is really important. I would say maybe for 5 to 10% of the doctors that think that they want to do this, sometimes, their team might not be ready, right? They're just like, there's really, really skeptical. Maybe the doctor like thinks he wants to do this, but he really needs someone there. There's definitely a sense of like, you want to be more on the innovative edge. You're open to understanding that, hey, if this takes anywhere between 30 to 90 days to really see the full synergy of having this model kind of blossom. And if you're not patient, you're looking for like right away. Yes, you'll definitely get a bang right away, assuming you get the right person. But there definitely takes a little bit of time. And you need to understand, like, if there's some fluidity, I mean, some patients there that's needed as you get this model kind of up to speed. Now, one of the things I like with, especially some of my doctors that do have coaches and whatnot, is that they actually redesigned their incentive program to actually align with the on-site team, saying, hey, if we can increase our revenue by $20,000 a month, we can actually, and not increase our expenses, we'll actually take that bonus and we'll give it back to the office. And so how that affects kind of practically speaking is that, again, if we're thinking about salaries and you're taking on par, I mean, this is just kind of a rough estimate in terms of what we're seeing. Someone that typically might make $30 an hour here in California, we can see very similar skill sets in another part of the country where we might pay them $25, $23 to $26 an hour as a pure expense. So that's pretty significant in terms of like, hey, how much money are we saving? And the goal here is if you're able to kind of take advantage of those other kind of the labor differential, especially in California, can you motivate your team members to be like, hey, if we can tap into this model, maybe we take some of the cost savings and we bring that back to the team. So those are examples of like, hey, how do you motivate your team from a financial perspective? All right, I want to talk a little bit about just some examples of how you can use this. Just contract short-term. So some of my offices just need like, hey, someone's going on maternity leave. That might be something where you're like, hey, I have one person in the front, they do everything. I know that they're going to be going on maternity leave in June. Can I get someone prepped to help me do that? Absolutely. This is a perfect example for that, especially because typically most of the team members come back, right? So that might be an example of like, hey, it's short-term, it's contract, and maybe hiring an employee at that time doesn't make a lot of sense. Special projects. I see people that if you just bought an office, maybe you have, maybe you're migrating from like EagleSoft to a cloud-based software where you need help, auditing the data. Again, if you bought a practice that has a bunch of AR, you want to reduce it, et cetera. Those are kind of like short-term special project needs where you're like, I need it just for a specific amount of time for a very focused effort where it's hard to find someone, for a full time, it's hard to just get labor for that. Those are examples of how you can use a remote dental professional. Also part-time phones. Yes, we want full-time coverage, but if you're looking at saying, hey, I really don't need full-time coverage, I just need something, here are the days where we know we have surge calls, maybe it's Monday mornings, or you might say, hey, actually, I looked at my data and I actually get a ton of calls on Saturdays. We don't have someone consistent on Saturdays. Can we get someone that can, answer calls on Saturdays or whatever those specific segments of the day are? AR, again, if you're in an office, I want you to get paid within 30 days of whenever you send out that claim. But there might be pieces here where you're like, hey, I don't need someone full-time just following up insurance. Maybe it's only 10 hours a week or 30 hours a month. Those are examples of part-time tasks. Hygiene recare calls. There's lots of tech around hygiene recare calls, but if you're one of those offices that really likes to have a personal approach, those are, again, things where you're like, they're important. They need to be done. If your hygiene schedule is falling apart, maybe you have someone doing it a few hours a day, a few hours a week to do that. And then full-time, the whole rev cycle, just depending on how big you are, can be a full or part-time job, but there's lots of things that can be full-time if you're big enough. And you feel like, hey, I really want a dedicated person to be able to do this, 4 to 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. So as you are thinking about the different partners, I would say what's really interesting is you're seeing kind of this blossoming of outsourcing companies. Just take a look at their model. I mean, you want to look at, hey, are they paid hourly, flat, monthly cost? Is it a per minute basis, a variable? Some of them are like, hey, they just charge you for every hygiene appointment they schedule. Some is like a pure management fee. Some is a percentage or hybrid. Just take a look at that, see what makes sense for you. For us, we have a monthly fee of $500 an hour that includes all the recruitment for as many front desk people as you need, and then we charge basically an overage of whatever the hourly rate that you select between you and your individual. So for us, we try to keep a really transparent model, and we allow our doctors to use that for as low as 5 hours a month to like some of them have 3 to 4 full-time call center members with us. But every company is a little different. One might work better for you. So those are the ones that we typically see as like the, as examples of that type of payment model. I know I want to give you some time to ask questions, but other due diligence questions, what kind of training is provided? Are you going to provide the training? Are they going to provide the training? If you can't provide it, do they provide it? Are they dental specific? What kind of QA activities do they do? So for us, for example, we do check-in. We have certain, obviously around the technology, we have ways that we can assess kind of change, how things are going. But those are definitely things to ask. How long have they been in the dental field? You have some companies that are not in dentistry, they're trying to answer calls, which may or may not work depending on what your level of expectations are with that call center. Contract length, I have seen some issues with like a 12-month contract where you're like, okay, great. You're like, okay, I'm going to need this. But then all of a sudden you find out, gosh, they're actually causing more harm than good. And then it's really hard for you to get out. So just be aware of what the contract length is, your ability to exit if it doesn't work out. Level of customization. This tends to be inversely related to how customized you want something. So best example is call centers. Sometimes you get call centers like, oh my God, it's only $1,500 a month for full time. It's amazing. But the customization is very low. It's like they answer they answer the call, they take the patient name, they take a message and the phone number, they send it over. A lot of my private practices, they typically don't love that. They want the ability for that person to be, to answer the call, schedule the appointment, provide follow their way of scheduling. Typically with call centers, what that one call center person is doing is they're answering calls for multiple people. So they're not able to really follow the script as well as you can with a dedicated professional. And references. I mean, for me, I think do your due diligence, ask if they work with another dentist. I think peer-to-peer is really important. Just make sure you feel really good about, moving into this. It is your baby. This is your practice. You spend millions of dollars on it. So I want to make sure that you're just making sure, that you're choosing the right partner for yourself. We talked a little bit about this, but again, kind of thinking about when you get into this, because this is a little bit of a commitment, there are absolutely like long-term impacts, but you want to just give yourself a little time. You can get some bang for your buck right away. But what I love to see is that most of my doctors, they give it time and really invest in like this model and like, hey, I'm dedicated. I want to commit to this. I know that having some redundancy is helpful. They end up adding services just because it gives their team more flexibility to do the stuff that they love. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. I think we talked a little bit about this, but I'll just end with this slide. Especially with we see a lot of this idea of like this DSOs coming into the market, and it's they have this idea that they're what private equity does really well, especially in the dental field, is they're able to assess the value of a business and double down on like how that company makes business, and you can do that as well in dentistry. And the idea here is like you want to have a really good understanding of like what makes your practice work. And if you really want to start to think like a DSO and those private equity folks, and we work with them, this is not a knockoff of them as well, but the goal here is like, if you're looking to do that, you think about your practice, say, hey, in 5 years, how do I triple the value of my business? And so with remote professionals, you can do that kind of multiplier effect, but you want to be able to think through like how to do that. You don't want to rush into the model. You want to be thoughtful of how you do it and just making sure that it's adjusting for exactly the kind of pace that you want and the kind of goals that you want to hit. So, be open to this model. I know that there's a lot of concerns around, hey, how do, what happens if it doesn't work out? Most of the time, as long as you're not doing a 12-month contract, you should be able to exit out. But for us, we're happy to share a lot of resources. I want you to see how effective it can be and where it can really support you as a private practice CAO in terms of like overcoming the staffing challenges. So I know I covered a lot there, and I'm sorry I should have left more time for questions, but let me pause here. Let's go through any questions that you might have. And Jim, I think if I can find my chat button here. Any specific, Jim, do you want to run through some of the questions, or should I
Sure.
just try to read them off?
I do think the doctor who asked most of the questions isn't in the meeting anymore, but
Oh,
I'll
no.
still give you a few of them. Have you noticed an increase in your dentists, or it could be San Mateo County, or just across the board, that are using remote dental professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in California in general, and in areas where it's hard to find staff or the labor is relatively expensive to what we're charging for our fees, I think it's incumbent that we look for ways that we can maximize our profit, right? Like, I mean, obviously you want to run a great business, you want to pay for great talent, but in the context that we don't have enough people to be able to do the work, we know that our fees are not increasing at the pace that's relative to what especially our Bay Area people want to make. We want to look for models and tools here that can give you what you need to run a dental practice in a way that like allows you to actually take home what you want to take home at the end of the day. And I think the remote model and the ability to tap into talent at a more cost-effective rate is absolutely something that you should, that I would look into and explore. Because if I can save you 20 to 40% off of the same type of talent at a pure expense rate, I mean, even just like from the labor perspective, I think that's a big deal for a practice where margins here are definitely getting more squeezed. So I would say yes, and that's just not in California. We're seeing this all across the country where the staffing shortages are really prominent. And I want to be clear here. All of us, the gold standard is in person, right? Like I don't know any dentist that would prefer like an offsite person. Typically, if you had a one-to-one, like, of course, we're going to want someone on site that has, all the experience, that's consistent, that knows what they're doing, great vibes, all of that, versus the remote professional. The idea here is that your remote dental professional isn't replacing your on-site person, it's complementing them. Because unless you have to do that, I mean, I'm a big fan of on-site. The question is like, if you don't have the on-site talent, it's too expensive or you don't have enough, how else can you run a really successful dental practice? And this model is an option for you. You don't need to use it all the time. I like to give it to, I want this model to be in your back pocket, because I've had those conversations where, you get taken hostage by your front desk person, right? Saying, hey, if I don't get this, I'm going to do this, right? And so this just gives you a tool, especially if you're like, I only have one front desk person, but I can't afford this, and they said they're going to leave. Or like, you have these like tough conversations around talent. So this is something that allows you to, I think, engage in those kind of conversations with more confidence and not feeling like you have to kind of bend at every single will. And, the question is, how can you engage in those conversations if you have this kind of tool as an option for you? And the question is, there one around HIPAA and non-US remote workers. HIPAA is a, and this is, I'm going to try to become like my HIPAA officer here. But it is really only applicable to US based team members. So if they're off-site, if they're offshore, you can't really apply HIPAA. I mean, basically it becomes you and your vendor. So you want to have a business associates agreement with you and whoever the vendor is. And typically then they're responsible for making sure that if they are contracting with someone offshore, that they have that all of those individuals, they're doing things like not using their family laptop, they're in a secure place, they're not calling patients like from the local coffee shop, they're not printing patient information and leaving it there, things are getting shredded. I mean, things that you should be doing already in the office. We just want to make sure now anyone offsite has they understand it, they're checking it off, and they're complying. Right, because little tiny things like not logging off a computer, maybe leaving your laptop, your workstation open, and your family. There's lots of little things like that can happen, and so you just want to make sure that whatever vendor you're using, they have some documentation and protocols to address those concerns. Are the remote workers hired by something like you or the office? So we will contract with all the professionals. The profession that allows you to not have to pay payroll taxes. We'll handle that contractual relationship, but the hiring process works just like your on-site, in the sense that you select the range, you select the team member, you give the criteria. What we'll do is we'll essentially, you'll give us a job description. We will query our 3,000 people saying, hey, Dr. Susan is looking for someone who's interested. This is what the qualifications she's looking for are. here's her pay rates. We'll give you a short list after we've done kind of a light interview. That doctor will decide. You can interview them, you can do your due diligence, and then you make the final selection. You decide the pay rates, and then once you decide the pay rates, you actually give it to us. We'll handle all the paperwork essentially, and then how we run is, again, it's a $500 a month fee, kind of platform fee that handles all the recruitment, and then also then an 80% overage to handle all the payroll. So we'll handle those pieces for you. So I guess short answer is they're hired by us, but they work directly with you. So you're handling all of the direction of that team member. And I think also, yes, I believe the webinar will be available, right, Jim?
Yes, we are recording it. It'll be available early next week.
One more question I see here. I know Doris might be gone here. An additional thing I think for us, and you can also do this again with, you can also just use it. If you already have people and you just want to use our tech to be able to have a remote professional kind of infrastructure, you're welcome to use our productivity platform. We also have things where you can actually take screenshots of the team members' workstation as well as activity trackers. It feels really big brothers, I know, but for us, I feel like, if they're working, they're doing what they need to do. Actually, we have good metrics. We can say, hey, Minnie, you're doing really great, but it looks like there for 3 hours there, you had a 3% mouse movement. What happened? Right? Because I'm also coming from the employer perspective where I don't want to pay for nothing, right? And I don't mind people taking time off. They just need to clock off, right? If they want to take a little break, I think that's totally fine. I just want to make sure that it's not on the doctor's dime and that you're getting for what you pay for. So, and all of our professionals, I think all the good ones are absolutely, we want to be really proud about the work that we're doing. We want to show how effective we are, how productive we are. And at the end of the day, all the technology documentation pieces allows them also to go back to the doctor and make a really valid case should they want an increase that hey, this is what I've done for you. So I think the technology is actually a good thing, not something that is, meant to be scary or kind of too overreaching. And I'll pull out this lunch. I don't know, Jim, if you can still see it. This is my information. My cell phone is on here as well. You're welcome to call or text me. I know a lot of doctors kind of just do it. Again, I appreciate you spending some time after work being on this. But if there's anything you want to talk about, feel free to call or text me. This is my cell. This is a QR link if you want to schedule a demo to learn more about how this works. You can just set up a call that works for your schedule. But here's my contact information. I'm here for you. I want to, this again, I know that I'm coming from an angle here, Swiss Monkey, but the goal here is that I want this model for you to be aware of this model. I know what it's like to run a dental practice. I know it can be really scary. It can be very, very tiring, not only for you, but for your team members as well. So, there are new models here that are available that weren't available 15 to 20 years ago at kind of this scale and at this kind of cost effectiveness and with this kind of level of blueprint. So I'm happy to be a resource for you. If you need anything, please do reach out.
Yeah, and Christine, could you put that slide up again? I don't see it actually.
Again, I'm just talking to myself here. Let me let me do that. Thank you, Jim. Can you see my slide now?
Looks like there was one more question in the chat. About if patient information is compromised in a non-US setting, what happens then? How does that affect the dental office legally?
Depends on the level of the breach and how many patients is it affecting. So I'm not going to pretend to be a HIPAA. I know I should probably know all the HIPAA stuff, but that's definitely one of our HIPAA questions. But I understand. But what I do know is it depends on what was breached, who was breached to, and how many people it affected. So sometimes if it's under a certain threshold, it's just notifying the patient, hey, your information was undisclosed to a third party. Here's what was disclosed. We retracted the information, and that should be good enough. But if it's hey, you sent out a blast email with everyone's social and date of birth, and it's 10,000 patients or something, I think the repercussions are going to be different. But again, a lot of those things are. If you have the right protocols in place and you have people signing off, there are ways that they're looking at, hey, have you done everything you can from the covered entity perspective to reduce the risk. We look at covered, look at the cyber the security breach there. I mean, they probably did as much as they possibly could and they still got hacked, right? So I think that's definitely where you want, and we have resources there if you want to talk to HIPAA compliance officer or a company that really does this every single day. We work with them as well. We're happy to connect you, but it is something that, especially now in these days, that's something you want to take seriously. I don't think it's not meant to scare us from like running a business and doing this effectively, but it is important because we are dealing with patient information.
So we don't see any more question. Thank you, Christine, for all the information tonight. It was informative and enlightening. And thank you everyone for joining. We hope you found this information helpful as well. This meeting was recorded and will be emailed and posted on the SMCDS YouTube channel. Enjoy the rest of your evening and thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Chris.